Ladies and gentlemen, members of the TFOA, I am very pleased to welcome you to the first TFOA lecture of the year. Our lecturer today is Dr. Ian Hodder. Ian Hodder was trained at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, and at Cambridge University, where he obtained his PhD in 1975. After a brief period teaching at Leeds, he returned to Cambridge, where he taught until 1999. During that time, he became professor of archaeology and was elected a fellow of the British Academy. In 1999, he moved to teach at Stanford University as the Dunlevie Family Professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Director of the Stanford Archaeology Center. His main large-scale excavation projects have been at Haddenham in the east of England and at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, where he worked from 1993 to 2018. He has been awarded the Oscar Montelius Medal by the Swedish Society of Antiquaries, the Huxley Memorial Medal by the Royal Anthropological Institute, the Faison International Prize, the Gold Medal by the Archaeological Institute of America, and has honorary doctorates from Bristol and Leiden universities. In 2019, he was appointed Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in the Queen's Honor List. His main books include Spatial Analysis and Archaeology, Symbols in Action, Reading the Past, The Domestication of Europe, The Archaeological Process, The Leopard's Tale, Revealing the Mysteries of Çatalhöyük, and An Archaeology of the Relationships Between Humans and Things. And now, Dr. Hodder, if you would do us the honor of taking us to Turkey to experience the joys and blunders of 25 years of work at the 9,000-year-old town of Çatalhöyük.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you for inviting me to talk to your group. It sounds like a really impressive group of young people interested in archaeology, so I'm very excited to talk about Çatalhöyük. Even though I'm now talking to our competitor, our competitor in Southern California, the Coates Institute. I'm based in the Archaeological Institute Center in Stanford, and we always feel a bit competitive with you guys down there. So let me share my screen, just to say that in fact I've retired from Stanford very recently, and I'm now teaching remotely at Koç University in Istanbul. So Çatalhöyük was first excavated by James Mellart in the 1960s. And it's a site that's located in central Turkey, quite near Ankara. And it was very quickly became famous because of the extraordinary finds that James Mellart made there in the 1960s. And of course, there was then great joy about that, which I participated in to some degree, because James Mellart was one of the people who taught me when I was as a student in London in the 60s. But the story ended rather sadly in the 60s, in the sense that James Mellart got caught up in a series of real blunders, real scandals that shocked the archaeological world, and particularly made the Turks very angry. And one result of those scandals was that the site was abandoned very abruptly in 1965. And that was itself of an enormous damage to the site. You can see here what the site looked like. It's a huge, great mound site, several football fields in size. And it was inhabited in about the 7th millennium BC, so from about 7,000 BC to 6,000. And about maybe 8,000 people lived there at their maximum. And so it had a huge amount of architecture in it, with wonderful wall paintings and so on. And you can see that in the trenches that Mellart left, there was fantastic erosion and destruction and loss of painting. So that initial set of blunders is really what led the Turks to ask that I go back in the 90s and try to start to create some sense of order and to pull the site back into a state that could be visited and could be part of an archaeological research environment. And so one of the main things that we did at Çatalhöyük when my team started was to create some infrastructure, which particularly involved a series of laboratories and living spaces and kitchens and so on, so that about 120 people at any one time during the summers would live there and do research. And another important part of the infrastructure that we constructed there was to build shelters over the excavation areas, the two main excavation areas, one in the north of the site that you can see here. This allows large numbers of people to come through and look at the remains. The site is all made of mud brick walling. And so it's, and this is not fired mud brick, it's just sun-dried mud brick. And so it very quickly erodes if open to the air. So that it needed to be sheltered. And the shelters allow year-round visitor access. So that was, those were important developments. This is another shelter that we constructed over the south part of the site. And you can see here the multiple buildings that we're excavating, going from the deeper part of the site up to the to the levels near the surface. So able to look at the way that society developed over 1,000 years in the Neolithic in Anatolia. And again, this allowed visiting throughout the year, and it's been a very important part of managing the site. So in many ways, it's been a joy to do this. This has been a very positive thing, creating this infrastructure and these shelters. But it also, I quickly realized, created a whole series of problems. And the major blunder that was produced by these shelters was that it created an environment that protected the buildings, but was almost impossible to work in because of the very, very high temperatures that were reached in the summer. And indeed, at times, it got so hot that survival became difficult. So 48 degrees centigrade, it got really very, very unpleasant. So that has remained a real sort of problem, particularly if you're this sort of person from Scotland, not used to the sort of heat that you get in the central Anatolian plain. Well, one of the main joys for me at working at Çatalhöyük has been the way that it has involved working with large numbers of different communities or interest groups or stakeholders. I actually was never able to get all of them around the same table. So this is a sort of notional idea that one can get all the sponsors to participate. And one can do that in various ways, but I never managed to get them all around one table. But I want to tell you a little bit about these different communities. So, because for me, that's been the great joy of Çatalhöyük, apart from the archaeology itself, is the opportunity to work with a diverse set of interests and try to manage their different engagements with the site. And of course, one of the most important groups that I want to talk about are the archaeologists themselves. And over the 25 years of working at Çatalhöyük, we've moved from a very small team to an increasingly large team. So towards the end, I suppose there are about 160 people doing various types of excavation and research. These are not very many students, but they're largely researchers of various sorts and local community members who worked with us. And that itself, this notion of having lots of different groups working at Çatalhöyük created a lot of joy in terms of trying to create interactions and synergies between them. But it also created a lot of problems in the sense that the different groups had their different interests, and these all had to be managed and negotiated. But I had a very strong view, and still do, that by bringing different types of archaeologists together from different countries and from different intellectual backgrounds, that this would open different windows into Çatalhöyük and make, in the end, for a better overall interpretation of the site. And as we worked through time, our methods changed. So when we started digging in the 90s, it was all on paper. As you dug, you were surrounded by lots of bits of paper that you had to fill in and plans that you had to fill in. And by the end of the time, had gone entirely digital. This, in my view, has enormous advantages as you're sitting in the trench with your tablet. You have access to the whole site database and can look at previous plans and previous records and do comparisons with other buildings and so on. It's an enormously flexible and powerful resource that then leads to the ability to do planning in a virtual environment and do very interesting interactive work where this is a group working in Italy and now at Duke University in the United States, where you can recreate Çatalhöyük virtually around you in an immersive environment. And then, as you can see here, you can click on various aspects of the architecture around you and ask questions and link in again to the database. So again, it's an interactive, immersive environment which can occur outside and away from Çatalhöyük. So really, really exciting, wonderful stuff. For me, the main disadvantage of this, the main sort of blunder, if you like, is that I had always been very keen to have the local community and Turkish archaeologists involved in the work that we're doing at Çatalhöyük. And as we became more and more digital, and as the technologies became more specialized, it became more and more difficult for people without fairly extensive education to participate. And I think it is the case that by the end of the process, more and more people have become excluded because they didn't know how to work ArcGIS or the Access database or whatever it was. And so there's a way that this is, but strangely, both inclusive and exclusive. And I regret the way that it led to exclusion of some sort of interest groups that I was particularly keen to promote. Another very key player, of course, is the Turkish state itself. And this list you can see here gives you some sense of the ways in which the Turkish state manages and controls the archaeological excavation in Turkey. For example, requiring that there be a Turkish assistant director, and everything that I did at Çatalhöyük had to be agreed with the government representatives who were with us all the time on the site. And I could not even remove a wall to go down deeper without special permission. And so the Turkish state obviously has a rightful and important role in all excavation that takes place in Turkey. And you can see some of the ways that they promote the site for national interests. In, for example, the World Expo 2010 in Shanghai, which used this painting from Çatalhöyük, which is supposed to show a volcano erupting over a town of little houses. And that is the motif that's shown on this exhibit location. And of course, the other example of this is that in 2012, the government put Çatalhöyük on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and that was agreed at a meeting in St. Petersburg. And so that was a very important event that has led to a lot of investment in the site and increases in tourism and so on. This type of international impact that is very much fostered by the state, but also fostered by other stakeholders, particularly our donors and sponsors, many of which were international companies and banks and so on that wanted to make sure that their donations to the project were recompensed by publicity. And a major way of getting publicity is to bring in big names and to encourage a sort of a major presence in the media. And you may not know some of these images here, but if you're British, you will recognize Andrew Marr in the top left, and the group in the top, in the bottom right, as a famous British children's program called Blue Peter. And I suppose you'll recognize Prince Charles in the top right and Morgan Freeman. But for me, the most important visitor for me was someone called Ian Thorpe, who was a Australian multi-Olympic gold medal winner swimmer, who came to the site as part of some strange program that that the Australians are putting together. Anyway, so this is all wonderful, and it creates a lot of interest in the site, and I found it, very enjoyable meeting all these types of people during the lifetime of the project, and this whole sort of public engagement side that's very closely linked to tourism and public media also has its value in the sense that it necessitates the creation of virtual reconstructions, so that Çatalhöyük, which is a site that's quite difficult to understand when you visit, it's just a lot of mud brick houses that are difficult to make sense of, and so these types of virtual reconstructions of the houses have been enormously interesting. We've done a huge number of them, and if you're interested, quite a lot of them are available online on the internet and so on, and sort of making these things and engaging with the specialists who do them has been a very important part of that public access. And we've already looked at this type of more technical interaction. So in some ways, that type of social public media skates over the site itself. It often tends to be a fairly sort of superficial interaction, and it often skates over the local community, who often feel excluded from those types of interactions. And so for me, it's always been important to try and engage the local community in ways that are more substantive. And we work very closely with people from local villages who work with us as laborers and also as find sorters and a whole range of different tasks on the project. And it's always been important to me to try and gauge their views about Çatalhöyük and to participate with them. This has often been very difficult. This is a very conservative Islamic area, a very rural area in central Turkey. And you can see the women are all covered. And in fact, the women and the men refused to come to meetings, the same meetings. We had to have separate meetings with the women and separate meetings with the men. And one of the difficulties was that the women and the men had completely different ideas about what should happen to Çatalhöyük. And so negotiating those differences has always been very, very difficult. But we engaged in a large number of educational programs. We had a program where every day 20 to 30 different students would spend the day at Çatalhöyük, learning about the archaeological process and also doing some digging of Mellart's old spoil tips, where he had not bothered to sieve the soil. So there was a large amount of stuff that we were able to recover by using these school children. And so that program was very, very successful, and thousands of kids over the 25 years came through that. But we were also very keen to engage in training the local community in archaeology and involving them in the whole process of conserving the site, particularly since we're not there through the whole year. And problems arise during the year when we're not there. And so it's important to have teams of local people who can work with the local museum in order to conserve and protect the site. And so some of this has been a great joy, and has led to very successful outputs. One of the guards at Çatalhöyük is this guy Sadrettin Dural, and he has written now actually a couple of books about Çatalhöyük and about his engagement with the site. He left school at 11, and so he had to learn how to use a laptop and how to write. And when he first wrote this book in Turkish, it consisted of 50,000 words in a long sequence without any full stops or commas or capital letters or anything like that, just a long series of words that we had to edit and make into a book. And it was published in English in America, and actually was reviewed by several of the major anthropological journals, including American Anthropologist, where it had a better review than any book that I've ever written. And so that this was a very successful outcome. But I've mentioned the difficulties working with the local community, and one of the, and this is here an example of a failure, a real blunder that didn't work out, where we were again trying to educate and train the local women in a local art or craft that has disappeared largely, which is the making of kilims, which is a type of Turkish carpet. And what you see here is women making these kilims using the designs from Çatalhöyük, integrating them into the kilims. And this was doing very well, a very successful project, but suddenly it was stopped because the men in the village felt that it was inappropriate for these young unmarried women, that it was inappropriate for women to be involved in this international team with its very different values and standards. And so the project was ended, and indeed any type of craft development or local skill development, working with local community was stopped by the elders, and particularly the imams in the villages. Another community that has led me to strange places is the goddess community, and Çatalhöyük is often seen as the source of the goddess movement because of images that I'll show you later on. And this is me talking on a fashion show catwalk in Istanbul, where the fashion show was designed by someone called Bahar Korçan, who was one of the goddess community members, and she designed her that season's clothes around the idea of Çatalhöyük. And it's not obvious exactly what the link is between these clothes and Çatalhöyük, but nevertheless she made that link. And it was a very strange event because I met all these sort of 6'5", very, very thin models who are all supposedly influenced by this image here, which is the small fat mother goddess from Çatalhöyük. And there are indeed some wonderful images from Çatalhöyük of what might be thought to be women. In fact, there are no genitalia shown on these images. So, you know, one could argue that these are sort of male sumo wrestlers or something, but most people see them as women. And the goddess engagement with Çatalhöyük has led to fun things like the fashion show, but it's also led us to really try and work harder on, well, what was the role of women at Çatalhöyük, and how did women play a part in society? Some people had argued that the Çatalhöyük was some sort of matriarchy or female-centered society. And so this question has always been a part of our work, and this is just a small part of which shows the diet, the carbon and nitrogen isotope diets for males and females that were found buried at Çatalhöyük. And you can see that there's no difference between the men and the women. And we've now done hundreds and hundreds of these types of isotopic analyses, and there is just no difference between the diet of men and women. And indeed, the way that men and women are buried, what they're buried with, the evidence of labor on their bones, all of these things show that men and women live very, very similar lives. And indeed that they were treated socially in very much the same way. And so I think it is possible to say that Çatalhöyük was a fairly egalitarian society, both in terms of social differences, but also in terms of gender differences. And that it didn't really, so of course there are differences in the way that men and women lived their lives in terms of having children, but in all other areas, this is a society which seems to have been relatively blind to gender. So that's an important development in our work. But particularly perhaps appropriate when talking to an audience in Los Angeles, Maria Gimbutas had written a lot about Çatalhöyük as part of her interest in the goddesses of the Neolithic. And this has encouraged a global goddess movement, or it's part of that global movement. And in many ways, that has very positive results, in the sense that we get busloads of goddess worshippers who come to Çatalhöyük, and I'm very happy I'm keen to support that. But it also has its negatives, so that, for example, fairly early on, while we were working at Çatalhöyük, the goddess community set up a women's center in the local village right by Çatalhöyük. And in that, the idea of that women's center in the local village was to engage the local community and to educate them, I suppose, in terms of their beliefs about the social position of women. So there were guitar singing sessions and dancing, and very much a new age environment, which was imposed on a village which was, extremely religiously conservative. And as a result of that, I think, although we never really knew why it happened, there was no evidence. But the women's center built by the goddesses was burned down by the community, and that has remained a real problem. These types of interactions, and including our own interactions, as I mentioned earlier with the Keelim case, have led really to a sort of a set of fairly negative relationships between the project and the community, such that in our last few years at Çatalhöyük, any type of community work was stopped by the government. The government, which is itself very nationalistic and very religious and anti-secular, was very worried about the way that the archaeologists and associated stakeholders were influencing the values in the local community, and wanted to stop all further community engagement. So this for me has been, a major blunder, in the sense that I always felt that working with the local community was extremely important, that getting local community buy-in and participation was a major thing that we should be doing. And to have that fail, despite the best interests and best intentions of the archaeologists, was very very hurtful. I should also mention that the people who were working with us on the community participation were very, very well intentioned. People like Sonia Atalay, who is seen as one of the major figures in terms of developing community-based participatory research globally. They were involved, she was involved, and I think, you know, everyone had the right intentions, but it turns out that in this particular context, that ended up having negative results. I think partly because, or maybe largely because of the political turn in Turkey towards an anti-secular, anti-democratic, one might argue, viewpoint. So I've gone through some of the different joys and blunders for me at Çatalhöyük. Just want to mention very quickly, some other changes in view and backwards and forwards that have come about through time in our work there. This is a view of one of Melot's reconstructions of one of the buildings at Çatalhöyük. And you can see over here what he interpreted as headless human bodies and vultures, perhaps taking the head or taking the flesh of these bodies. And he then interpreted the burials that were found beneath the floors of the houses as the result of the excarnation of human bodies and the removal of flesh by vultures, and then placing them in the ground. So when we started, we had this notion, and the first team working at Çatalhöyük in the 90s, as part of my project, very much wanted to argue against that interpretation by Melot. Despite the evidence of those paintings, they argued that the evidence showed that most of the bodies had been placed in graves beneath the floors of the houses, fully fleshed, that these were just very tightly packed together, fully fleshed bodies. You can see they are very, very tightly pulled together, but nevertheless, this first team argued that that was the process, fully fleshed bodies placed in the grave. They recognized that it is true that heads were removed. So there is a link to those paintings in the sense of, you can see there's the head removal here. And this is a reconstruction of another burial where a skull removed from some body has been placed in the grave. And you can just perhaps see the evidence of plastering on the face. It's been reconstructed here. So they recognized that there was some sort of secondary movement of bones, but thought that on the whole, bodies were placed in fully fleshed. As we've done more and more research, the story has changed yet again, and particularly sort of histological analysis of the bone has suggested that in fact these bodies were often dried out or desiccated or smoked, so that the flesh was very much depleted before the bodies were placed in the graves, and that the bodies were carefully wrapped and bundled, which is why they seem to be in anatomical position. And indeed, there's just been an article fairly recently where some of the new human remains team at Çatalhöyük have argued that maybe Melot was right right after all, that it's possible that some bodies at least were left out as for flesh to be removed by vultures before the bodies were placed in the grave. So this is an example of going around in a complete circle with a lot of science in between, but starting in one position, going away from it and coming back to it. And this for me has been, this is what science should be about in my view, this sort of challenging ideas and coming back and reinterpreting things and reassessing things, and working with a large team that continually changes has been very exciting in allowing that sort of process to happen. And for one final example that I want to give of this is is our reconstruction of the environment around Çatalhöyük in the 7th millennium BC, where initially we did a lot of coring around the site and decided that during the certain times of the year, the landscape was very heavily flooded, and that this very heavy flooding would have meant that the agricultural fields had to be a long way from the mound itself. And this seemed odd, but nevertheless, that's what the initial coring and sedimentological and so on analysis of the core suggested. Later on, another group of paleoenvironmentalists came and sort of challenged this interpretation and showed through much more detailed coring across the landscape that although there was some flooding, it was of a very different nature. And they argued that in fact, the area around Çatalhöyük was more like this, with lots of little rivulets, small little channels, but with dry land. So they're talking about the development of the landscape here. So this is what Çatalhöyük would have looked like, they argue, with dry land around and so on. So it wasn't a massive flood, so that the fields actually could have been very near the site. This is a debate that doesn't seem to be resolved. The two groups of paleoenvironmentalists are still fighting with each other over what's the right interpretation. But I think they're gradually coming to a sort of nuanced position in between the two. And so this is, again, another example of how science moves forward by challenging interpretations and so on. Anyway, I hope that gives you a sense of what it's like to direct a project like this at Çatalhöyük. And for me, it's been a period of enormous joy, but almost always headaches and blunders that one has to sort of deal with. And I guess that's all part of the course. But I hope that some of you will feel inspired to go down this route at some point or other and take on one of these international projects. It's enormously rewarding, and I think really can contribute in enormous ways, both to communities of various sorts and to nations, and also to international understanding. And just here, I wanted to put this up so you get some sense of the different ways in which that project was funded. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions that you might have.